There's a moment in 2014 when a geneticist at a lab in Copenhagen stared at a screen and didn't say anything for about 30 seconds. The data was right there. Every tribe they'd mapped, every population they'd cross-referenced, every branch of the human family tree laid out in cold, molecular detail. And the result for the Sioux, the Lakota, the Dakota, the Nakota was something nobody in that room had expected to feel the way it felt, not because it was wrong, but because it was so exactly, so completely right, that it made the last 150 years of American history look like one long, expensive, well-documented mistake. This is the story of what that test found. But to understand why the result was so devastating, and I mean devastating in both directions, toward the science and toward everything that came after, you need to start not in a lab, but in a courtroom. And not just any courtroom, the kind where a nation went to prove that it owned the land it already lived on. The Black Hills, Paha Sapa, sacred ground, by the reckoning of the Lakota Sioux. In 1868, the United States signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie. That treaty guaranteed the Sioux perpetual ownership of the Black Hills for as long as the grass shall grow and the rivers shall run, which is the treaty language for "we really mean this one." 6 years later, General Custer led an expedition into those same hills. His geologists found gold. Within 2 years, the U.S. government had taken the land back. Just like that. The grass was still growing. When the Sioux went to court, not immediately, but eventually, over the course of nearly a century, one of the questions that kept surfacing, in one form or another, was this: how long have you really been here? Because the implication, never fully stated but always hovering, was that maybe the Sioux were migrants too. Maybe they drifted in from somewhere else not so long ago. Maybe their claim to those hills was no older, spiritually or legally, than the claim of anyone else. That's the question the DNA answered. And the answer was not subtle. Let's talk about what genetic testing actually does when you apply it to an indigenous population. You're looking at specific markers in the genome sequences that mutate at known rates over generations, like a biological clock. By comparing those markers across populations worldwide, geneticists can trace lineages backward. They can see who's related to whom, how long ago those populations diverged, and where on the planet specific genetic signatures first appeared. It's not perfect, and researchers are careful to say so. But the resolution has gotten extraordinarily precise, especially in the last 15 years. What they found when they mapped the Sioux genome against the full spectrum of global populations, against tribes from Patagonia to the Pacific Northwest, against populations in Siberia, in East Asia, in Europe and Africa, and the Middle East, was a genetic signature that had been sitting in North America, essentially unchanged, for somewhere between 15 and 18,000 years. Let that land for a second. 15 to 18,000 years. That's not the Bronze Age. That's not ancient Rome. That's not even the pyramids. That's the Ice Age. That's a time when half of North America was buried under a glacier, 2 kilometers thick. And the ancestors of the Sioux were already here, on the other side of that ice wall, in what would eventually become the Great Plains. The origin story of that migration is one of the great chapters in human prehistory, and the DNA traces it precisely. About 20,000 years ago, a population of humans in northeastern Asia, in the region of what is now Siberia, began moving eastward. They followed the game, they followed the cold, and they eventually crossed a land bridge that no longer exists, a vast plain between modern Russia and Alaska called Beringia that was exposed during the last ice age when sea levels dropped dramatically. These weren't people making a decision to discover a new continent. They were hunters following herds, covering maybe a few miles a generation. And one day, their descendants were standing in a place that no human had ever stood before. What happened next took thousands of years. The ice began to melt, corridors opened up. Populations spread south, then east, then further south, diversifying as they went, adapting to every climate the Americas had to offer: tundra, rainforest, desert, high altitude, coastline. By the time the descendants of those first Beringians reached the tip of South America, Humans had been in the Americas for at least 1,000 years. Some models say considerably longer. And here's where the Sioux data becomes specifically extraordinary, rather than just broadly significant. Most large migration events leave a genetic residue of mixing. You move into a new area, you encounter other groups. There's intermarriage, and the genomes start to blur at the edges. What the researchers found in the Sioux profile was the opposite, a lineage that had remained remarkably, almost stubbornly, coherent. Not because the Sioux never interacted with other groups, they absolutely did, and trade networks across the plains were extensive and ancient. But the core genetic signature showed a population that had been in continuous, identifiable existence for an extraordinary length of time, with a depth of roots in the North American continent that matched almost no other tribe in the study. Some tribes showed evidence of multiple migration waves, populations that had come over from Asia at different times and blended. Some showed more recent genetic exchange with neighboring groups. The Sioux showed something older and more intact. Their haplogroup distribution, particularly the Y chromosome markers passed down through male lineages, placed them squarely in the founding population of the Americas, not a later arrival, not a secondary migration, the original wave. Now, here's the thing that the headlines got slightly wrong, and that's worth correcting. The news stories at the time framed this as DNA confirms Native American history. And that's true, but it's not specific enough, because the Sioux didn't need their history confirmed. They knew their history. The Lakota oral tradition doesn't say we came here a long time ago from somewhere else. It says something more radical than that. It says we emerged from the earth here. Specifically here, the Black Hills are not just a place the Sioux occupied. They are, in the Lakota cosmology, the origin point, the navel of the world, the place from which the Lakota people themselves came into being. Science and mythology are not the same thing, and a geneticist would be the first to tell you that emerging from the earth is not a literal description of the Beringia crossing. But what the DNA confirmed, in the most rigorous possible terms, is that the Sioux have been connected to that specific landscape for longer than almost any human population on Earth has been connected to any landscape at all. The gap between "we emerged from here" and "we have been here for 18,000 years" is a gap of metaphor, not of fact. The fact is the same. And that fact had immediate and uncomfortable implications for about a dozen ongoing legal disputes, because the Black Hills case had never fully closed. In 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in United States v. Sioux Nation of Indians that the government's seizure of the Black Hills in 1877 was, quote, a taking of tribal property that violated the Fifth Amendment. The court awarded $105 million in compensation, which, with interest, had grown to over $1 billion by the time anyone checked. The Sioux refused to accept it. They still do. The money sits in a federal account, untouched, gathering interest, because the Sioux position has never been about money, it's been about land. The land that the DNA now confirmed they'd been on for longer than human civilization has existed anywhere on Earth. The legal system doesn't quite know what to do with a number like 18,000 years. Courts think in terms of recorded history, of treaties, of documented prior possession. The Treaty of Fort Laramie is from 1868, and even that can be argued about in terms of ratification and implementation and which bands were signatories. But 18,000 years doesn't fit in a legal brief. It doesn't fit in a precedent. It doesn't fit in any framework that Western law has for thinking about belonging. And so the result sat there, confirmed, undisputed, and largely, in terms of its legal consequences, unapplied. But let's step back from the politics for a moment, because there's another layer to this study that got less attention and deserves considerably more. When the researchers compared the Sioux genome against all other tribes in the Americas, not just looking for origin points, but for genetic distance, for how similar or different various native populations are from each other, what they found complicated a lot of assumptions about the pre-Columbian Americas. The common image of North America before European contact is of discrete, isolated tribes living in rough geographic territories, occasionally trading or fighting but otherwise not deeply interconnected. The DNA suggests something different. There were broad genetic clusters across the continent that implied movement, contact, and exchange on a scale that archaeology alone hadn't fully captured. The Great Plains, in particular the Sioux heartland, showed evidence of being a kind of crossroads, a place where populations moving in different directions had passed through, encountered each other, sometimes merged, and sometimes diverged. The Sioux stood at that crossroads for a very long time, and their genetic distinctiveness wasn't the result of isolation, it was the result of duration. They were the constant in a landscape of variables. There's also the question of what the comparison revealed about population collapse. This part of the research is harder to look at, but it's important. The genetic data from post-contact Native American populations shows the clearest bottleneck in human history. A bottleneck is what geneticists call a moment when a population dramatically shrinks, and the loss of genetic diversity that follows tells you, in retrospect, how severe the shrinkage was. The Black Death in Europe left a genetic signature. The famines of various centuries left signatures, but nothing in the data looks like what happened to Native American populations after 1492. The Sioux were among the last large tribes to experience that collapse at full force. Their relative isolation on the northern plains and their military effectiveness meant they maintained population and territory longer than most. But the data shows it anyway, a compression in the genetic record, a narrowing, a silence where diversity used to be. Sitting Bull died in 1890. Wounded Knee happened 2 weeks later, in December of that year, when U.S. soldiers killed somewhere between 150 and 300 Lakota men, women, and children at a camp on the Pine Ridge Reservation. The genetic record doesn't show names, but it shows the shape of the catastrophe. It shows what was lost. What the DNA can't show, and this is something the researchers were explicit about, is culture, language, ceremony. The specific knowledge encoded in 18,000 years of living in a particular landscape, which plants do what in which season, where the water runs in a dry year, how the bison moved before the bison were gone, what the hills mean when the light hits them in October. Genetics is a record of biological continuity. It says, these people were here, and these people are their descendants, and the line has not been broken. But it says nothing about whether the languages are still spoken, whether the ceremonies are still performed, whether the knowledge is still intact. And that's the thing that makes the DNA result feel like both a vindication and a wound at the same time. Yes, the science confirms what the Sioux have always said, that they are an ancient people with deep roots in a specific place, but the confirmation arrives in the middle of a crisis. The Pine Ridge Reservation, home to a large part of the Oglala Lakota Nation, has one of the highest poverty rates in the United States. Life expectancy there is comparable to some developing nations. Unemployment hovers around 80% in some estimates. The suicide rate among young people is more than twice the national average. The genetic record says 18,000 years of survival. The present says survival is still not guaranteed. I want to be careful here, because it's easy for this kind of story to drift into a particular mode: the noble, tragic people, ancient and wronged, held up as an object of reflection for an outside audience. That's not what this is. The Sioux Nation is not a museum exhibit. The Lakota Language Project is actively working to reverse language loss and has trained hundreds of new speakers. There are Sioux doctors, lawyers, engineers, artists, activists, politicians. The nation has its own government, its own courts, its own schools. The DNA result is being used, right now, by Sioux legal advocates in ongoing negotiations about sacred sites. It's a living document in a living dispute, not a monument to a concluded history. And there is one more thing the study found that I've been holding back, because it changes the texture of everything else. When researchers analyzed the genetic distance between the Sioux and the populations of East Asia, specifically the populations in Siberia and Mongolia, most closely related to the founding Beringians, they found something that nobody had expected to be as striking as it turned out to be. The Sioux genome is, among all measured Native American tribes, one of the closest genetic matches to those original Siberian founding populations. Not the most distant, as you might expect from a group that's been in the Americas for 18,000 years. Closer, almost as if the Sioux lineage had spent less time mixing with other groups and more time preserving something. What that means, interpreted carefully and without overclaiming, is that the Sioux may carry, in their DNA, one of the clearest windows we have into what the founders of the Americas actually looked like, genetically. The people who crossed Beringia and walked into an empty continent, the ones who started everything, left their clearest echo not in ancient bones from Siberia, but in the living people of the northern plains. The beginning and the present, separated by 18,000 years, touching. The scientists stared at that result for 30 seconds, and then one of them said something that wasn't in the published paper, but that got passed around in the acknowledgments and interviews later. She said, "I kept thinking about what it would feel like to have always known this, and to have spent 150 years being asked to prove it." That's the question that outlives the data. Because the Sioux did always know it. They knew it the way you know things that are built into the structure of your life rather than written in books. The hills were theirs, the land remembered them, the grass was still growing. And now, a sequencing machine in a Copenhagen lab had confirmed what 1,000 years of oral tradition had been saying all along, not because the tradition needed scientific validation to be true, but because science had finally caught up to the truth that was already there. The Black Hills case is still unresolved. The money is still in the federal account. The negotiations are still ongoing. The Sioux still say, "We don't want the money. We want the land." What do you do with that? What does a country do with the knowledge that the people it displaced had been in that specific place for 18,000 years, had been confirmed by the hardest science available, and are still here, still asking for what was taken? That question doesn't have a neat answer, which is probably why nobody in power is in a hurry to ask it out loud. But you might want to think about it, because the thing about 18,000 years is that it makes every counterargument look very, very recent. And the thing about DNA is that it doesn't negotiate. If this story landed differently than you expected, if it changed something in how you'd thought about it before, share it with someone who would feel the same. And if you want to go deeper on the legal history, on the specific science, on where the Black Hills case stands today, leave that in the comments. That's the conversation worth having.